I hope you have been intrigued by Berkeley's argumentation, even if you don't quite find yourself persuaded to become an idealist. But we do want to take a closer look now at Berkeley's arguments about matter and his rejection of the conception of matter. One aspect of that we've done already to some extent, and that is he argues that the only evidence that we have for matter is the only evidence that we have for anything, and that is the things that we perceive. One of Berkeley's more famous sayings is that to be is to be perceived, esse est percipi. Perception is the essence of existence. Whatever exists, exists as something that is perceived. The only thing that exists are minds and ideas. So, the only thing that we perceive, in fact, are the various kinds of qualities that we associate with bodies. Color, shape, texture, so on and so forth. We don't perceive anything that we call matter. We just perceive these various qualities, and our arguments have shown that we have to suppose these qualities to be things that exist as ideas in the mind, not anything that we have any evidence to say exists somehow independently of the mind. So this makes matter a kind of a superfluous hypothesis. Right? We don't need matter to explain anything. So to suppose the existence of matter would mean that we're supposing the existence of something for which we have no actual evidence. Now, of course, our inclination is to want to suppose that things, we seem to be sort of hardwired to suppose that these things really exist. Indeed, that was, if you recall, that was the source, that was an element in Descartes' final argument in his sixth meditation for why we have to admit the material world as really existing. We have this almost innate urge to believe that the material world really exists independently of and outside of the mind. And so if it didn't, and if we didn't have any way of rationally determining that it didn't, then that would make God into some sort of a deceiver. Okay? So that was Descartes. Okay? And we'll see, however, that Berkeley not only argues that we don't have any evidence for the existence of matter, so that matter would be a superfluous hypothesis that we don't need, he argues further that we do have a way of demonstrating that the very idea of matter is a self-contradictory notion. And this argument is fairly simple, but it hinges, notice that the argument is going to hinge upon what Berkeley takes as his definition of matter. And it's a definition of matter that could completely accord with Descartes' notion of matter as a substance, or Spinoza's notion of matter as an attribute of God or nature, or Locke's notion of matter as some kind of material stuff made up of particles. And this is that matter is an inert stuff. Okay? So notice that this very much accords with Descartes' conception. And indeed, Descartes' conception of mind and body have very much shaped and informed the way that all of the philosophers of this period have been dealing with the ideas of mind and the idea of body throughout this entire period, regardless of whether we're talking about the rationalists or the empiricists. It's very much shaped in accordance with those conceptions. So if we go back to Descartes now and remember what did Descartes say. Descartes said that there are two types of substances. There are minds, which are thinking things which are not extended. So in other words, immaterial, free thinking things. And there are bodies, which are extended things that do not think. Okay? So minds can think and act. Bodies can just kind of be there, be this stuff that's there, and be acted upon. So body is just this inert stuff. Okay? Something can happen to it if a force is exerted upon it from outside of it. It's not like a mind that can think, choose, and act of its own will, and therefore initiate some kind of motion. Right? A body doesn't initiate motion by itself. It can only initiate motion from some sort of external force. Right? The rock is just going to sit there and stay in the same place until somebody kicks it and moves it to another place, or the rain and the wind erode it over time gradually, or some other external force transforms it or moves it in some way or another. So matter is just this inert stuff that's just there. Now, what does inert stuff do? Well, it doesn't do anything. Okay, that's Berkeley's point. And so what are we supposing that matter is doing? Well, matter is supposed to somehow act upon us. It's supposed to stimulate our sensory organs somehow or other, so that we then mentally perceive these things that correspond to physical events outside of us. And therefore, this conception of matter is the conception of something that is both inert, that is to say, inactive, and at the same time active, that is to say, not inactive. And this is contradictory. Therefore, matter, says Berkeley, cannot exist. So this is a fairly clever argument. Okay, you might try to think if there are some holes that you can poke into it. Of course, one thing to notice is that this argument does rely upon the particular definition of matter that Berkeley is using here, a definition that I think he would find is not just his own definition, but as something that would be widely accepted in his day. It's a definition that perhaps a physicist today would not in any way accept at all as a definition of matter. Now, this leaves us with one additional question that I'm sure you've picked up on already in the text, but it's worth a brief comment. Okay? So there's one other issue, one other problem that bothers Hylas, and it leads us into something that Berkeley needs to assert in order to make his entire theory work, and that is probably something that you find to be the least plausible aspect of everything that Berkeley has to say. And this is the question, well, how is it that you and I, so if all there are minds and ideas, how is it that you and I agree upon the things that we perceive? Right? If we both walk into a room, we can count the pieces of furniture in the room and we're going to come up with the same number. If we both walk out of that room and nobody's left in the room, we do not think that the furniture has just vanished or that the entire room has vanished. And we can walk back into that room at any time and we'll find exactly the same things there. If to be is to be perceived, and we turn out the lights and leave the room, shouldn't things go out of existence because they're not being perceived? That, it seems, would make sense, and that might be problematic, because now we would have a world where things are constantly popping into and popping out of existence all of the time. We don't know from what source, and they seem to harmonize in a way. In other words, the chair exists because I perceive it and because you perceive it, but we both seem more or less to perceive the same things. Maybe not always exactly the same, but we can certainly coordinate our perceptions. So Berkeley's answer to this is, of course, his conception of what God actually does, and God for Berkeley has to be a very busy guy. Because God is also a spirit. God is a mind, like the human being is a mind, only a much more powerful mind, indeed an infinitely powerful mind. So God always perceives everything, though not in the same way that we perceive things. So about the existence of the chair, if we turn out the lights and leave the room, does it go out of existence? Well, no, it doesn't. It still exists. But it's still just an idea. It's not a physical thing. It's an idea in the mind of God. And why does the chair exist in God's mind and in our mind too? Why does it exist in our mind? Well, because not only does God have to think the chair, but God has to think things that we perceive so that we perceive them all in the right way, right? So in other words, God is sort of like this magnificent switchboard or supercomputer that assures that each of us all perceive the right things from the right angles at the right times for every time throughout all time that anyone is perceiving anything. So all of this is, so God is really perception central, coordinating and making sure that all perceptions are properly harmonized in accordance with the laws of nature and in agreement.